We've got a very important week of fantasy football coming up, and there's a lot of bye weeks this week. So before I get into these rankings, all I ask is that you go down there, drop a like on this video, and subscribe to the channel to show your support. Now, getting into our first tier right here, I've got Derrick Henry and Saquon Barkley at number 1 and 2. Listen, these two guys, not only do they have great matchups this week, Derrick Henry versus the Bengals on Thursday night, and then Saquon Barkley at the Dallas Cowboys. They're obviously the two best running backs in fantasy football, really when you add it up over the overall season, right? Derrick Henry can easily go off for massive weeks any week, and he already did it one time versus Cincinnati this year. I expect nothing less from him on Thursday night. And then with Saquon Barkley, the only thing that could possibly stop him is that he was dealing with back soreness. He's dealing with back soreness right now, so we'll see if he ends up being hampered by it a little bit. I would imagine that he's going to handle a full workload, and it's not going to affect him against the disgraceful Dallas Cowboys defense. And then Bijan Robinson to round out the tier. I know, he deserves it. He deserves to be here in this top tier because he's been fantastic. The past month for Bijan has been unbelievably excellent. There's been lots of good matchups. There's been some iffy matchups in there, and he just continues to overcome. This week against the Saints in New Orleans, that matchup is excellent. I actually like it better than I would have 1 week or 2 weeks ago because they fired Dennis Allen, who was not a good head coach by any stretch of the imagination, but he was actually a good defensive coordinator. So with this move, I think Bijan Robinson has a massive game at the New Orleans Saints this week. Now, dropping down to our next tier right here, I've got Etienne at 4 and Tyrone Williams at 5. Obviously, Etienne made me look like a big idiot in Week 9 fantasy football. I discussed it on what I got right and wrong, and really the fact is, he's matchup proof. Whenever Tua is there, he's basically bust proof too. He's matchup proof and he's bust proof whenever Tua Tagovailoa is the quarterback there. So at the Los Angeles Rams, I do think that this defense is actually pretty unforgiving. They've been really good over the past month, but Etienne is just too important. He gets the ball in so many different ways, and with Tyrone Williams here, last week was the first week in a while he didn't score a touchdown. He's been scoring every week this year except for last week. So I don't really worry about him in this matchup versus Miami. I just think that Etienne probably has more opportunities to get more explosive plays. But Tyrone Williams is obviously still rightfully here inside the top 5 versus the Miami Dolphins in the same matchup. And then Joe Mixon at 6 and Alvin Kamara at number 7 here. Now with Joe Mixon taking on a rougher matchup versus the Detroit Lions here, it doesn't really matter. His fantasy upside is not affected by matchups at this point. We all know at this point that Joe Mixon is the best. He's one of the best running backs in fantasy. What I do like is that the potential that they get Nico Collins back, but Detroit is very stout against the running back position in fantasy football. So what are the chances that maybe it's more of a pass-heavy game script for the Houston Texans versus run-heavy? Obviously, they need Joe Mixon, which is why he's still going to be inside the top 6. And then with Alvin Kamara versus the Atlanta Falcons, again, they're riding this guy like a horse. And I do think that this defense is a good matchup to take on for Alvin Kamara. Ultimately, it just comes down to, are they going to just ride him till his wheels fall off? It feels like that right now. So that's the only thing that I have some worries about. But Kamara at this point, he's just been too dominant because he is getting so many opportunities through the air, on the ground. It depends on whether or not he takes on a good rushing matchup to where we see a major ceiling. And I do think it could be a ceiling game for Alvin Kamara because this Falcons defense is nothing special. Dropping down to our next tier right here, Jahmyr Gibbs at 8 and James Cook at number 9. Jahmyr Gibbs at the Texans. Listen, I don't love this matchup particularly, but obviously we all know with Jahmyr Gibbs, the upside through the air is absolutely ridiculous. You can see the amount of targets per game that he gets on the screen right now, and just the big explosion plays because of his efficiency metrics that you can also see on the screen. He's been dominant, specifically over the past month or so in fantasy. I don't think it stops even against a tougher defense, and with James Cook, one thing about James Cook that's been a little disappointing, it's been a little bit like last year at the beginning, where he was some weeks he would kind of get less volume than he did the week prior, right? So last week he didn't handle a ton of work I do think this week is going to be a James Cook week. At the Indianapolis Colts, the matchup is good for running backs here. So I do like the potential that Cook has, and obviously Cook's running the ball and catching the ball very well. So the efficiency is not the problem. The problem is the usage week to week, but I do think this is a good James Cook bounce back week. Jonathan Taylor at 10 and Bree Hall at 11. Jonathan Taylor at this point, versus the Buffalo Bills, I do think that this matchup is okay. I don't particularly hate this matchup or anything like that. Ultimately, what kind of worries me at this point with Jonathan Taylor is, does Joe Flacco bounce back? Because if he doesn't bounce back, I don't know how likely it is Buffalo respects the pass. And then they just key in on stopping Taylor, which they have a good defense. And if they decide to key in on stopping Taylor, then it's going to be a tough day, kind of like it was versus Minnesota. So that's the only thing that worries me. But I do think Joe Flacco will bounce back this week. So ultimately, I've got JT still inside the top 12. And then Bree Hall at 11 at Arizona this week. I do think that this matchup is low-key tough. And the one thing I'll say with Brees, obviously everybody who owns Brees is disappointed right now. It's just kind of been one of those years where it's like, you drafted him in the first round and he's not producing on a weekly basis here. And you can see it like on the screen, he has not been the most efficient running back this year. This is not normal Bree Hall behavior. He's usually much more efficient than this, but the volume is still always there. Last week was actually a good game for Brees, not for fantasy. He actually averaged like 5 yards per carry and had like almost 100 yards from scrimmage. So Bree Hall actually did well last week. It just didn't pay off for fantasy. Any week, Bree Hall can go off, so he's not leaving the top 12 for me. It's just not going to happen. Dropping down to our next tier, James Conner at 12 and J.K. Dobbins at 13. Listen, James Conner versus the Jets in that same matchup. The one thing, again, that I get concerned about with Conner is that sometimes they do stray away from the run. Now, versus the Jets defense, I do think that this is obviously a fantastic matchup for James Cook. Running backs have been able to take advantage of the Jets over the last month of fantasy football. It's been a disaster. They have been just an objectively worse defense without Robert Saleh. And they're injured too. Like, it's not a good defensive play. It just ultimately kind of reminds me of the James Cook thing with James Conner, which is like sometimes they do give less work. And they also were including Amari DiMercato and Trey Benson last week. So I do think there's a potential that Conner starts to lose volume a little bit, but I'm not too worried about it ultimately. And then J.K. Dobbins at 13 versus the Tennessee Titans. The matchup is excellent. I love this matchup. I think J.K. and the Chargers are going to rip apart the Tennessee Titans defense here. Tennessee's defense did well in fantasy last week. Yeah, you got to remember it was the Patriots. So it's not like they were taking on some really potent offense here. And the Chargers offense has been starting to play really, really good football. It's just a great matchup here. J.K. Dobbins, I could easily see him having another 2-touchdown game and having a close to 100-yard game on the ground. Christian McCaffrey / Jordan Mason / Isaac Guerrero here at 14. Listen, we don't know yet what's going to happen. Obviously, Christian McCaffrey returned to practice. That's a great sign. But I have not seen word, whether yes or no, whether Christian McCaffrey's playing this week. Obviously, if he plays, he goes right back into your lineup. This is not the question here. The question is, how much can you expect from him his first week back? At Tampa Bay, the matchup would indicate that he's got a lot of upside. And McCaffrey's a player, obviously has tons of upside. I'm cautioning this one a little bit just because of the fact that McCaffrey, this is not some like injury that's like been minor, obviously. It's kept him out the first 9 weeks of the season. So I'm cautioning expectations just a little bit. And then with Mason here, Mason is kind of in the same boat because Mason is dealing with his own injury as well. He also returned to practice. So even if those two guys don't go, I think Guerrero is a top 15 guy this week as well. Because again, the matchup versus the Bucs really speaks volumes on this one, in my opinion. So depending on which 49ers running back we get, they're going to be here at 14. Aaron Jones at 15 and Tyrone Tracy Jr. at 16. Aaron Jones at the Jacksonville Jaguars. The matchup doesn't get a ton better than this. Jacksonville's defense is an absolute disgrace. Aaron Jones easily can just give you a massive explosion week on not many opportunities because he's been so efficient and he's just got the pass catching upside. So he's got to be here at 15 because his floor is just a little bit lower, but his upside is obviously really high. And then Tyrone Tracy Jr. versus Carolina. This is a Germany game. So obviously I don't really I don't really worry about the matchup as far as being in Germany too much. Tyrone Tracy Jr. is taking on the team that's dead last versus running back. So I've got no worries about the matchup. I love the matchup. I just think that Tyrone Tracy Jr., I don't know whether I think he'll be a 100-yard rusher this week, but I do know that they're going to feed him the ball on the ground and in the air. I think Tyrone Tracy Jr.'s upside this week is really stupid high. This is your chance to take advantage of Underdog right here, because Lamar Jackson's projection this week on Underdog is 0.5 total yards. That is what his projection is, and it's free money when you hit the higher. So if you have not taken advantage of Underdog yet, go down in the comments below, grab the link that's there, and use code FFN to sign up for Underdog. They'll match your first deposit 50% up to $1,000 of bonus cash when you take advantage of this sweat-free projection for Lamar Jackson this week. Dropping down to our next tier, David Montgomery at number 17 and Kareem Hunt at 18. With Montgomery here, he's a little bit lower in my rankings this week because I do think that this matchup's tough. Like, at Houston on Sunday night, Houston's going to come in motivated. Their defense has been really good for the most part over the last month. They have a good defense here, and they're tough on running backs. So I do think that this ultimately is not the best matchup, and Montgomery, it might be a little bit of a touchdown-dependent game. I don't think that Montgomery obviously has the upside that Jahmyr Gibbs does on a weekly basis. It really comes down to, is he getting in the end zone or not? And I do think that this is going to be necessary for him to have a good game in fantasy this week for him to get in the end zone. And then with Kareem Hunt at 18 versus Denver here, I think Kareem Hunt, if you looked at that game on Monday night versus the Bucs, obviously he didn't look good for the most part. Then he ends up getting in the end zone. So Kareem Hunt is going to be fine. Like, he's on the Kansas City Chiefs. There's ultimately just going to be upside every single week because of the Kansas City Chiefs being who they are. So versus Denver, I don't love the matchup at all, but ultimately, he's a cheap running back. He's getting the volume that you need. He's ultimately efficient enough for you to get fantasy points on a consistent basis. Really does remind me a lot of David Montgomery. He's on a great offense, he's getting the volume you need, and he's also kind of a touchdown lock at this point. DeAndre Swift at 19 and Chuba Hubbard at 20. With DeAndre Swift versus the New England Patriots here, listen, his ceiling is obviously ultimately stupid high. Like, I obviously see the ceiling. This Bears offense is starting to scare me again, man. Their offense has looked disastrous out of the bye. You know what the problem is? Shane Waldron is a terrible offensive coordinator, and that doesn't absolve Caleb Williams of blame, but obviously with the play calling here, there's times where it's like, if you go away from Swift, your offense is going to not be good, because Swift is absolutely pivotal to the Chicago Bears offense. It's undeniable. So with DeAndre Swift, I do see upside versus the New England Patriots this week, but I also see a pretty low floor. And then with Chuba Hubbard here at 20 versus the Giants, listen, I'll talk about Jonathan Brooks. You might say, you might talk, Jonathan Brooks is not taking over this job this week. At the very least, it's not happening this week. He may play this game. I wouldn't be surprised if he plays. I'm expecting him to play. But Chuba Hubbard, they had a lot of chances to trade him at the trade deadline, and they're not doing it. Why is that? Because Dave Canales wants to win football games, and that's his best offensive weapon at this point. Chuba Hubbard is going to be fine. He's taking on the Giants. The only reason he's down a little bit lower this week is if they give Brooks 5, 6, 7 opportunities, then we got to move down Chuba Hubbard a little bit, but Chuba's still leading the backfield. Dropping down to our next tier right here. Raheem Mostert at 21 and Tony Pollard at 22. So with Raheem Mostert, if you looked at the last 2 weeks with Raheem Mostert, the first week back with Tua, he ended up getting in the end zone twice. So obviously he actually had some really good upside that week. Well, obviously last week wasn't a particularly great game in fantasy football for him, but if you actually look at his numbers and what he actually produced, he was averaging like 5 yards per carry on like 10 opportunities. And he also had some catches out of the backfield as well. So he's not irrelevant in this offense. He's not the same upside play as he was last year, but it doesn't matter. Like, he's going to be involved on a weekly basis, giving him touchdown upside on a weekly basis, because Miami's offense, again, with Tua, is really potent. I don't love the matchup again, but I do love the fact that he is still involved in this Miami offensive game plan on a weekly basis. And then with Tony Pollard at 22, at the Los Angeles Chargers this week, I think that Tony Pollard is in a bad matchup here. Now, I ranked him lower than I should have last week versus the New England Patriots. And listen, the Tony Pollard thing, it's just because this offense is so bad. And they played the Patriots last week. Like, the Chargers defense is much better. than the New England Patriots defense is. So it's a tougher matchup. Obviously, since he's their only guy, aside from Calvin Ridley in this offense that actually works, he's got to be inside the top 25, but this offense is so prone to doing nothing on a weekly basis. So with Pollard, lower floor, but definitely a pretty good ceiling here at 22. Chase Brown at 23, and Rico Dowdle at 24. With Chase Brown at the Baltimore Ravens, I don't love the matchup again. I called him a must start last week. It was right. He ended up having a really good game versus the Las Vegas Raiders. Of course he did, because he's playing the Raiders here. Now, obviously, he's taken over a 3-down role because Zach Moss is done. Prayers up for him. He may never play again. But obviously, with Chase Brown, it's definitely his job at this point. They got Khalil Herbert, but he is not going to be taking a good amount of opportunities on Thursday night versus the Ravens. This ultimately just comes down to a matchup I don't trust again. I think this is a rough matchup for him, but obviously, because he's a 3-down back, he's inside the top 25 because he's also a part of a potent offense as well. And then with Rico Dowdle, man, I've doubted Rico Dowdle over the weeks, and he is proving me wrong. I mean, last week he obviously had a ridiculous end zone touchdown that he ended up catching off a couple bobbles. But ultimately, he looked okay. He looked all right. They're taking on the Eagles this week, and they're depleted, man. No Dak this week, likely no CeeDee Lamb this week. So Rico Dowdle is going to be a big part of this game plan. Ultimately, I don't trust this offense, especially against the Eagles this week. So I don't think Rico has that much upside, but obviously I've got to keep him inside my top 25 because he's earned it at this point. Najee Harris at 25 and Austin Ekeler at 26. With Najee Harris here, he's taking on the Washington Commanders and vice versa with Austin Ekeler here. Listen, Najee Harris and Austin Ekeler are in the same exact spot for me right now. Because with Austin Ekeler, first of all, Brian Robinson Jr., I was reading Dan Quinn talk on Wednesday, and what he said basically was like, oh, listen, we're playing the long game with him. We've got bigger hopes, and, if he needs to miss another couple games, so be it. That's basically what he said. So I think Ekeler ends up playing, and Ekeler ultimately is a lower ceiling play because he's still getting volume taken away from him by different running backs. Chris Rodriguez Jr., Jeremy McNichols, they're taking away touches from Austin Ekeler. Obviously, he's on a great offense, has touchdown upside, so he's got to be inside this list. But with Najee Harris here at 25, I think Najee Harris is in a situation where coming out of the bye week, this team should be looking pretty good. But also, Jaylen Warren's involved, and they're potentially getting Cordarrelle Patterson back. So what we've seen over the past 3 weeks with Najee, I think might be coming to an end. Again, just a lower ceiling play, I think, this week with all those running backs in the room right now. But ultimately, I think his floor is actually higher than Austin Ekeler's this week. Dropping down to our last tier right here. Rashad White at 27 and Ramondre Stevenson at 28. With Rashad White versus San Francisco, listen, what happened last week versus the Kansas City Chiefs is that what we learned is he's still not great on the ground. He did get in the end zone, and that ultimately saved his week. But ultimately, Bucky is taking over the running back touches. He's taking over the running situation here. Versus San Francisco, it's not a good matchup. That's why I've got him over Bucky Irving at 29, because I ultimately think that Bucky Irving is in a situation where he's just going up against another tough run defense, also coming off a bye week. So I prefer Rashad White in this game because Rashad White is still getting plenty of opportunities through the air, and he's been a little bit more effective than Bucky Irving up to this point. With Ramondre Stevenson at Chicago, it's a tough matchup here. Low floor, ultimately has a pretty high ceiling because he has been, getting in the end zone, and he's ultimately their most effective offensive weapon right now. So obviously he's inside the top 30, but it's a tough matchup at the Chicago Bears. And then with Travis Etienne at 30, rounding the whole thing out, it's depressing, man, because he boots out Tank Bigsby, who's one spot below him at 31. They're taking on the Vikings this week. Matchup is obviously doesn't get a lot tougher than this with running backs here. And Etienne all he's done is muddied up this backfield. They're both getting very minimal amount of work, and obviously Etienne's been bad this year. So with Etienne, I just don't trust the offense. I don't trust the way he's playing, and I really hate this matchup. Instead of doing my favorite underdog running back of the week this week, I'm going to give you 3 picks this week on underdog at the running back position that I love the most. Derrick Henry higher than 0.5 total rushing and receiving touchdowns this week. That's my ultimate favorite. He's taking on the Bengals. He already destroyed them in the first time they played. I love this one. Hit the higher on it. Tyrone Tracy Jr. higher than 0.5 rushing and reception touchdowns as well. Versus the Panthers, dead last versus running backs in fantasy football. I think Tracy gets back into the end zone this week. And then J.K. Dobbins, higher than 0.5 rushing and reception touchdowns. J.K. Dobbins, this matchup is fantastic this week because J.K. Dobbins is taking on the Tennessee Titans. I think he gets back in the end zone for a second straight week as well. So let me know how your lineup is starting to look this week. And if you want to see the top 30 wide receiver rankings this week in fantasy, click on this video right here.